Isaac Newton. The name itself is synonymous with scientific enlightenment. The man who gave us gravity, calculus, the laws of motion, the embodiment of rational thought, of objective truth, of knowledge shared openly for the benefit of humanity. Except that's not who he was. Not entirely. Newton published reluctantly. He held back his discoveries for decades. When the Principia Mathematica finally appeared in 1687, it was only because astronomer Edmund Halley begged him to release it and paid for the printing himself. Newton's papers on calculus circulated privately among a few colleagues, but not formally published until arguments over priority forced his hand. And that's just what he eventually let the world see. Thousands of pages remained locked away. Manuscripts on mathematics that predated anyone else's work by years, sometimes decades. Notes on optics he kept in his desk. Theological writings he coded in personal shorthand. Alchemical experiments documented in meticulous detail, then hidden. Why? This wasn't laziness. This wasn't procrastination. Newton was methodical, obsessive even. He documented everything. He just chose not to share it. The traditional explanation is that he was a perfectionist, unwilling to publish until his work was flawless. But that's too simple, too generous. Newton didn't just delay publication. He actively concealed entire branches of his research. He used pseudonyms. He wrote in cipher. He marked manuscripts not for print and locked them away where they wouldn't be discovered until after his death. So here's the real question. What exactly was Isaac Newton afraid to show the world? What did the father of modern science know that he thought we couldn't handle? The answer reveals a man far more complex, conflicted, and human than the marble statue history made of him. Newton lived in an age where the wrong idea could destroy you, professionally, socially, physically, where heresy was a crime, where challenging orthodoxy meant risking everything. This isn't about the genius we celebrate. This is about the discoveries he buried, the knowledge he locked away, the truths he considered too dangerous to speak aloud. Let's start with what he deliberately kept silent. Let's start with the mathematics. The thing Newton is most famous for. In 1666, during the plague year when Cambridge University closed and Newton retreated to his family estate, he developed the foundations of calculus. He called it the method of flux ions. It was revolutionary, a mathematical framework for understanding change, motion, rates of variation. It would transform physics, engineering, economics, virtually every quantitative field. He didn't publish it. Not in 1666. Not in 1670. Not in 1680. For decades, these ideas existed only in Newton's private papers and in letters to a select few correspondents. He shared fragments with colleagues but refused to release a complete, public account. Meanwhile, in Germany, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was working on the same problem. Leibniz published his version of calculus in 1684. Newton's response? Anger. Accusations of plagiarism. A bitter, decades-long priority dispute that consumed both men. But here's the thing, Newton had developed calculus first. He had the evidence in his unpublished manuscripts. If he'd published in the 1660s or 1670s, there would have been no controversy. His priority would have been unquestionable. So why didn't he? His own explanation was that he wanted to avoid disputes and criticism, that he found public controversy distasteful, that he preferred to perfect his work in private rather than expose it to premature judgment. Essentially, he was afraid of what people would say. This pattern repeats throughout his career. His groundbreaking work on optics, demonstrating that white light is composed of a spectrum of colors, was completed by 1672. He presented a paper to the Royal Society, and Robert Hooke, one of England's leading scientists, criticized it. Newton's reaction was extreme. He threatened to quit the Royal Society entirely. He withdrew from public scientific discourse, and he delayed publishing his complete optical research for 3 decades. The book Optics finally appeared in 1704, but only after Hooke was dead and couldn't criticize it. This wasn't just caution. This was deliberate concealment driven by fear of intellectual conflict and public judgment. Newton's unpublished manuscripts reveal a man constantly working, constantly discovering, constantly documenting, but rarely willing to let the world see results. Mathematical innovations that would have accelerated scientific progress sat in desk drawers. Methods that other mathematicians reinvented decades later had already been solved by Newton in private notebooks he never showed anyone. He had theorems on infinite series that anticipated later developments by generations, solutions to differential equations, geometric insights that wouldn't appear in textbooks until the 18th and 19th centuries, techniques for solving problems that his contemporaries struggled with, all developed, all documented, all locked away in his private collection. The delay wasn't about perfectionism. His published works contain errors and gaps just like anyone else's. The delay was about control, about avoiding criticism, about maintaining an image of infallibility by never exposing work to scrutiny until he was absolutely certain it was unassailable. And even then, he often didn't publish. He simply kept it to himself, reasoning that the world wasn't ready, or that he wasn't ready to face the world's judgment. But mathematics was the least controversial of Newton's hidden research. The really sensitive material, the work he knew could destroy his reputation, went much deeper than equations. Here's a fact that shatters the Newton myth. More than half of his personal writings are about alchemy. Not physics, not mathematics, alchemy. Over 1 million words on the transmutation of metals, the philosopher's stone, the nature of matter at its most mystical level. Detailed records of experiments conducted in secret, recipes for obscure chemical processes, interpretations of ancient alchemical texts written in deliberately cryptic language. Newton spent decades on this. He built a laboratory and conducted alchemical experiments with obsessive precision. He copied entire alchemical manuscripts by hand, adding his own annotations and theories. He used coded language and pseudonyms, Jehovah Sanctus Unus instead of Isaac Newton, and he made absolutely certain none of it would be published during his lifetime. Why? Because by the late 17th century, alchemy was increasingly viewed as superstition. The new mechanical philosophy, the very worldview Newton's physics helped establish, was rendering alchemy intellectually suspect. For Newton to be caught doing serious alchemical work would have been professional suicide. So he hid it completely. When he wrote letters about alchemy, he used elaborate codes and symbolic language that only other alchemists would understand. When he referenced alchemical ideas, he did so indirectly, burying them in metaphor. His alchemical manuscripts were locked away, kept separate from his scientific papers, marked private. But here's what makes this truly fascinating. Newton didn't treat alchemy as separate from his scientific work. For him, it was all part of the same quest, understanding the fundamental nature of reality. His experiments with prisms and light were happening alongside experiments with mercury and sulfur. His mathematical descriptions of gravitational forces coexisted with his search for the hidden forces that transmuted base metals into gold. Newton believed that matter had active principles, hidden properties, secret sympathies that mechanical philosophy alone couldn't explain. Alchemy, to him, wasn't pseudoscience. It was the investigation of forces that Newton's own physics couldn't yet describe. He genuinely thought he might discover the philosopher's stone. He believed transmutation was possible. He spent years trying to decode what ancient alchemists had allegedly known. And he was sophisticated about it. This wasn't mysticism detached from experiment. Newton's alchemical notebooks show the same rigorous methodology he applied to optics. Careful observations, controlled conditions, repeated trials. He approached alchemy as an empirical science, just one investigating phenomena that official science didn't acknowledge. But he knew the world wouldn't see it that way. If Newton's contemporaries had discovered the extent of his alchemical obsession, it would have destroyed him. The man who represented rationality, who had mathematized the universe, secretly pursuing the philosopher's stone. Unthinkable, laughable, disqualifying, so he compartmentalized his life. The public Newton was the mathematical physicist, the discoverer of gravity, the president of the Royal Society. The private Newton was an alchemist working by candlelight, heating metals, searching for transformations that science said were impossible. His alchemical writings remained hidden for centuries after his death. When they were finally examined in the 20th century, scholars were shocked. The great rationalist, it turned out, had devoted more time to alchemy than to the work that made him famous. More pages, more hours, more intellectual energy poured into transmutation than into the Principia. Newton knew exactly what he was hiding and why. This wasn't accidental secrecy. This was calculated self-preservation. He understood that his reputation as a rational scientist depended on keeping his alchemical pursuits absolutely invisible. But alchemy wasn't even his most dangerous secret. Now we get to the truly dangerous material. The secret that could have ended not just Newton's career, but his freedom and possibly his life. Isaac Newton did not believe in the Trinity. In 17th century England, this was heresy. Official doctrine held that God exists as three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in one divine essence. To deny this was to reject a cornerstone of Christian orthodoxy. And in Newton's time, heresy could mean arrest, imprisonment, loss of position, public disgrace. Yet Newton was convinced the Trinity was a theological error, a corruption introduced into Christianity centuries after Christ. He believed in God. He believed in Christ. But he rejected the idea that Christ was co-equal and co-eternal with God the Father. He considered Trinitarianism a deviation from original Christian teaching. And he wrote extensively about it. Thousands of pages of theological analysis, biblical interpretation, historical research into church councils and doctrinal development. He traced what he saw as the corruption of Christianity through specific texts and specific moments in early church history. These writings were never intended for publication. Newton understood exactly what would happen if they became public. Let's be clear about the stakes. Newton held positions at Cambridge University that required him to take holy orders or be exempted through royal dispensation. He was a fellow of Trinity College, named after the very doctrine he rejected. He later became warden and then master of the Royal Mint, positions requiring loyalty to the Crown and the Church of England. If his anti-Trinitarian views had been discovered, all of this would have collapsed. He would have been forced out of Cambridge. He would have lost his government positions. He might have faced prosecution. At minimum, he would have been professionally destroyed and socially shunned. Newton knew this, so he was meticulous in his concealment. He wrote his theological manuscripts in secret. He used coded language when discussing religion with correspondents. He never published a single word of his true religious beliefs. When he was required to give sermons as part of his Cambridge position, he preached orthodox doctrine he privately rejected. He lived a lie, for decades, because the truth would have destroyed him. But Newton didn't just hide his views, he actively researched and developed them. This wasn't casual doubt. This was deep, scholarly, obsessive theological investigation. He studied ancient manuscripts. He analyzed translations. He examined the proceedings of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where Trinitarian doctrine was formalized, and concluded the council had gotten it wrong. He believed he had uncovered a fundamental error at the heart of Christianity, and he couldn't tell anyone. The psychological weight of this must have been immense. Newton was a profoundly religious man. His theological beliefs weren't peripheral, they were central to how he understood the universe. He saw his scientific work as revealing God's design. His physics and his theology were inseparable in his mind. But he had to pretend, had to perform orthodoxy while privately believing something completely different, had to watch others accept doctrines he thought were false, knowing that revealing the truth would cost him everything. Some of his theological manuscripts contain notes like "not to be published" or "for private use only." Newton was writing for himself or perhaps for posterity, but certainly not for his contemporaries. After his death, his heirs quickly realized how explosive this material was. They suppressed it immediately, kept it hidden from public view. It wasn't until the 20th century that scholars fully grasped the extent of Newton's heretical beliefs and the decades of careful concealment. Imagine, the most famous scientist in England, the man who represented rational enlightenment, was secretly a theological heretic who would have been condemned by the very institutions that honored him. Newton protected his reputation by burying the truth. He chose safety over honesty, survival over integrity, public acceptance over private conviction. And in 17th century England, it's hard to argue he made the wrong choice. The cost of honesty would have been catastrophic, professionally, socially, possibly legally. But the secrecy took a toll, and it shaped how Newton interacted with the world. Let's talk about Newton's psychology, because his secrecy wasn't just strategic, it was pathological. Newton couldn't handle criticism at all. When Robert Hooke criticized his paper on light and colors in 1672, Newton didn't just disagree. He spiraled. He wrote bitter, defensive letters. He threatened to resign from the Royal Society. He privately raged against Hooke for years. This wasn't healthy disagreement. This was a man for whom any challenge to his work felt like a personal attack. Newton's response to criticism was to withdraw. After the Hooke incident, he largely stopped publishing for decades. He continued working, his research never stopped, but he refused to expose himself to public scrutiny. He would share ideas privately with trusted correspondents, but formal publication? Too risky, too vulnerable. He developed a pattern. Perfect work in private, share only with people who wouldn't criticize, delay publication until all critics were dead or ignorable. This isn't speculation. Newton explicitly said he avoided publication to escape disputes and controversies. He told Leibniz he preferred keeping discoveries private to intellectual combat. But the real issue wasn't just criticism, it was the possibility of being wrong. Newton needed to be seen as infallible. His public persona was the genius who had unlocked the universe's secrets. To admit error, to be caught in a mistake, to have someone point out a flaw, this was unthinkable. So he controlled everything. He only published when he was absolutely certain. He revised obsessively. He waited until circumstances were ideal. And even then, he often held back. The calculus dispute with Leibniz shows this. Newton had earlier work, better evidence, stronger claim. But his delay in publishing created the controversy. If he'd shared methods openly early, there would have been no dispute. But that required exposing imperfect, developing work to criticism. Newton preferred bitter, decades-long priority battles to premature exposure. His personal relationships reflected this pattern. He had few close friendships. He kept people distant. He was secretive even with colleagues. Trust was difficult. There are accounts of Newton suffering what we'd now call nervous breakdowns, periods of intense paranoia, insomnia, erratic behavior. In 1693, he sent bizarre, accusatory letters to friends, then apologized without explanation. Scholars debate whether this was mental illness, mercury poisoning from alchemy, or psychological collapse from stress. Probably all three. Newton lived in constant fear of exposure. Fear that his alchemy would be discovered. Fear that his heretical theology would be revealed. Fear that someone would find an error in his mathematics. Fear that his carefully constructed public image would crack. This fear shaped everything. It determined what he published, when he published, who he trusted, how he interacted with other scientists. It made him secretive, defensive, sometimes cruel. And it worked. During his lifetime, Newton maintained his reputation as the infallible genius. The secrets stayed hidden. The image remained intact. But the cost was enormous. Newton was not a happy man. He was isolated, anxious, constantly on guard. He had intellectual triumphs but few genuine connections. He died wealthy and honored but alone. The fear that drove his secrecy also poisoned his life. And there's one more dimension to this. Newton didn't just hide things out of fear. Sometimes he withheld knowledge because he genuinely believed the world wasn't ready for it. But Newton's secrecy wasn't purely defensive. Sometimes he withheld knowledge because he genuinely believed humanity wasn't ready for it. This is where Newton becomes genuinely complicated. He saw himself as custodian of dangerous truths. Truths that, if released prematurely or to the wrong people, could be misunderstood, misused, or cause harm. He believed knowledge carried responsibility, and that not all truths should be shared with everyone. His alchemical work contains this attitude explicitly. Alchemy was traditionally esoteric, passed master to student through coded language to keep it from unworthy hands. Newton embraced this. His manuscripts used deliberate obscurity, symbolic language, cryptic references, incomplete instructions. Even writing for himself, he sometimes encoded findings. Why? Because he believed alchemical knowledge was powerful and potentially dangerous. If the wrong people gained access to transmutation, to the manipulation of matter's fundamental properties, the consequences could be catastrophic. Or so he thought. This wasn't paranoia. This was Newton taking seriously the idea that knowledge has ethical dimensions. That discovering how nature works doesn't automatically mean you should tell everyone how to replicate your discoveries. The same thinking appears in his theological work. Newton believed he had uncovered fundamental errors in Christian doctrine. But releasing this publicly wouldn't just endanger him, it would create theological chaos. Provoke religious conflict.
Déstabilise institution.
Was he right? Debatable. But he believed the world needed to be prepared to evolve to handle these truths without chaos. There's something deeply paternalistic about this. Newton positioning himself as sole judge of what others could handle, deciding unilaterally that certain knowledge should remain hidden. The opposite of the open science ideal we associate with enlightenment. But it's also philosophically interesting, because Newton was grappling with a real problem. What do you do when you discover something true but potentially harmful? Some of his unpublished manuscripts contain notes indicating they were never meant to see print. Marginal comments like, "not for publication," or "private only." These weren't drafts waiting for revision. They were finished thoughts that Newton deliberately chose to keep locked away. He was curating knowledge, controlling what entered the public sphere. And he saw this as part of his responsibility as a natural philosopher. This raises uncomfortable questions. Who decides what knowledge is too dangerous? Who has the right to withhold truth? And what happens to human progress when geniuses decide to hide their discoveries? Newton would probably argue that he was protecting people from their own ignorance and malice, that premature revelation of certain truths would cause more harm than good. That wisdom includes knowing when to stay silent. But the counterargument is obvious. Suppressing knowledge, even with good intentions, is anti-scientific. It assumes you alone have wisdom to judge what others can handle. It treats humanity as children needing protection from difficult truths. Newton died with thousands of pages unpublished. Some has since been analyzed. But we'll never know how much was destroyed, how much was hidden so well we haven't found it, how many discoveries vanished because Newton decided they were better left secret. He wasn't just afraid of judgment. He was making judgments about what the world deserved to know. And those judgments had consequences. So what did Newton's silence cost? Let's be concrete about this. Newton developed calculus in the 1660s. Leibniz published his version in 1684. That's nearly 20 years' delay. During those decades, mathematicians across Europe struggled with problems Newton had already solved. They were reinventing methods Newton had perfected but kept private. Mathematical progress was literally slowed by Newton's refusal to share. The same pattern repeats across his work. Optical theories developed in the 1670s weren't published until 1704, 30 years later. Methods for solving differential equations sat in his desk. Geometric techniques remained in notebooks. Other scientists had to rediscover these independently. Time was wasted. Effort was duplicated. The scientific community was handicapped because one man chose silence. And it's not just about delay. It's about what never happened. When you publish work, others build on it. They extend it, apply it to new problems, find connections you didn't see. Science advances through cumulative collaboration. But Newton's unpublished work couldn't be built upon because no one knew it existed. How many potential discoveries were never made because Newton's foundations weren't available? How many scientists died without realizing problems they struggled with had already been solved? We'll never know, but the cost was real. Newton's theological and alchemical work is harder to assess. Maybe keeping his anti-Trinitarian views secret prevented religious conflict. Maybe his alchemical findings were dangerous or wrong, and suppressing them saved wasted effort. Or maybe he was wrong about the danger. Maybe open theological debate would have been productive. Maybe sharing alchemical experiments, even failed ones, would have helped chemistry develop faster. Again, we can't know. But we can say this: Newton made those decisions unilaterally for everyone forever. The manuscripts that did survive and were eventually published often came out decades or centuries after his death. By then, the ideas were often obsolete. Others had arrived at the same conclusions through different paths. Newton's priority was acknowledged historically, but his work had lost power to influence the present. That's the ultimate cost of silence: irrelevance. Newton feared publishing would expose him to criticism and threaten his reputation. Instead, his refusal made much of his work historically irrelevant. The reputation he protected so carefully would have been greater if he'd been willing to take risks. Science thrives on openness, on free exchange of ideas, on building collectively. Newton understood this intellectually. He praised others who contributed. But when it came to his own work, he couldn't do it. Fear and pride trapped him, and the world moved forward more slowly because of it. There's no way to calculate exact cost. No formula for lost progress. But every historian of science acknowledges it. Newton's secrecy was a drag on human knowledge. The genius who unlocked so many of nature's secrets also locked away discoveries that could have accelerated everything. So was Newton right to stay silent? There's no clean answer. He lived in a world where wrong belief could destroy you, where heresy was criminal, where controversy could end careers. His caution wasn't paranoia, it was survival. And yet, Newton's fear went beyond rational self-preservation. It became pathological. It isolated him. It deprived the world of knowledge that could have accelerated progress by decades. There's a tension here that every scientist eventually faces. When do you speak? And when do you stay silent? Newton had real reasons for secrecy, but he also had excuses. He hid behind threat of criticism when the real issue was his inability to handle it. He claimed the world wasn't ready when maybe he wasn't ready to face the world. The philosopher's question: if you discover something true but dangerous, do you have an obligation to share it or to suppress it? Newton thought he knew the answer. He appointed himself guardian of knowledge too volatile for public consumption. He decided alone what humanity could handle. Was that wisdom or arrogance? Maybe both. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of Newton's caution was justified. His heretical theology would have destroyed him. His alchemical obsessions would have discredited his physics. The social cost of honesty would have been catastrophic. But the cost of silence was real. Progress delayed. Knowledge lost. Collaboration prevented. Newton made a choice. Safety over truth. Reputation over contribution. And we can't simply condemn him because we don't know what we would have done. It's easy to praise openness from safety, where heresy won't get you arrested. Newton lived in a different world. A smaller, more dangerous world. But his story raises questions that remain relevant. What do we owe to truth? What do we owe ourselves? When knowledge becomes a burden, when it isolates you, endangers you, what's the right choice?
Newton chose silence.
He took secrets to the grave. Was he a coward? A pragmatist? A martyr? Or just human, brilliant but flawed, visionary but afraid? History remembers him as a genius, and he was. But he was also a man who knew too much and said too little.